This is the story of a married couple in Brisbane, Australia, where almost nobody knew who these two people really were, not their families, not their neighbors, not even their closest friends. It's the story of Mayang Prasetyo and Marcus Volke, and of a crime in October 2014 that became infamous less for its brutality than for the way the media chose to tell it. We're going to do two things over the next several minutes. The first is to lay out what actually happened, drawing on a coronial inquest that delivered its findings in May 2017, and the second is to look at why this case keeps coming up, years later, whenever people talk about journalism, ethics, and the way we describe victims. The deeper you go into this story, the clearer one thing becomes. The most disturbing part wasn't only the crime. It was everything that came after. Let's begin with who these two people were. Mayang Prasetyo grew up in Indonesia, and she was 27 years old when she died. Born on the 13th of February, 1987, in Bandar Lampung, in the Lampung province of Sumatra, she carried the birth name Febri Andriansia. She lived as a transgender woman. Her mother, Nining Sakarni, described breast and facial cosmetic surgery that Mayang underwent in Thailand in March of 2009. Even the name she went by was a choice she'd made herself, taking Mayang from the Indonesian singer Mayang Sari and Prasetyo from a former boyfriend. Everyone who knew her described the same person, someone warm and cheerful and bubbly, fascinated by celebrities and full of plans. She dreamed of building a successful business, of motherhood, of what she called complete womanhood. Dreams weren't the whole picture, though. As the eldest of three siblings, Mayang carried her family on her shoulders, supporting her single mother and her two younger sisters back home, and covering the girls' schooling along with her mother's expenses. In 2014, those sisters were 15 and 18 years old. Most of her family never fully understood how she earned that money. Mayang worked as a high-class transgender escort, while friends and relatives were fed a tidier story, that she danced in cabaret shows on cruise ships. Her clients paid her well, anywhere from around $200 up to $500 an hour. All of it stayed carefully walled off from the life her family pictured. She wasn't the only person in this marriage living behind a wall. Marcus Peter Volke came from Australia, and he was also 27. Geelong, Victoria, was his birthplace, and he grew up around Ballarat, where he attended Ballarat High School. To the family near Ballarat, Marcus was a chef. Trained alongside his brother, he'd recently picked up a job at a restaurant in Bulimba, in Brisbane, starting in late September of 2014. People who knew him painted a picture of someone intelligent and health-conscious, a non-smoker and non-drinker who knew his way around nutrition and fitness and trained seriously in martial arts. The coroner who later reviewed the case found no suggestion that Volke had ever been abusive or violent in any earlier relationship. A second life ran underneath that one, and his family knew nothing about it. Marcus worked as an escort too, advertising under different names in Australia and overseas, and he'd run up a serious amount of credit card debt, the kind where, as the coroner put it, he was using loans to pay off other loans. His mental health struggles stretched back about a decade. There'd been a suicide attempt in 2006, treatment for depression beginning in 2007, and a visit to his GP just weeks before October 2014 for anxiety, depression, and poor sleep, which ended with a prescription for an antidepressant. None of this reached his family near Ballarat, at least not in connection with his Brisbane life. They pictured a chef working on cruise ships. The escort work stayed hidden, the debt stayed hidden, and Mayang stayed hidden completely, because they had no idea she existed. Two people, then, each one living a double life, each one hiding the truth from the people closest to them. How they found each other is the next piece, and it starts with the marriage. Melbourne brought them together in 2013, after Marcus began working as a male escort. They married in Denmark on the 1st of August that year, though that marriage was never legally recognized in Australia. The inquest later described their union as two things layered on top of each other. One layer held a genuine spousal relationship, while the other operated as a straightforward business arrangement. Marcus married Mayang to help her secure an Australian visa, and in return she put her escort earnings toward paying down his debt and brought him into transgender clubs in Australia and overseas. Across 2013 and 2014, the pair traveled through Asia and Europe working in the sex industry, visited Mayang's mother in Indonesia, kept joint bank accounts, and posted couple photos on social media. Underneath all of that ran tension and control. Mayang had threatened to expose Marcus, his sex work, and the real shape of their arrangement to his family if he ever tried to walk away. And she kept watch over his social media and his email. Advocates who later spoke about the case pointed to a pattern that turns up in some relationships involving transgender women, where one partner wields the threat of revealing someone's identity as leverage and as a form of mental pressure. September 2014 brought the couple back from Bali to settle in Brisbane. After viewing apartments early that month, they moved on the 13th into a ground-floor, one-bedroom unit with a courtyard on Commercial Road in the suburb of Tenerife, and what sold them on it, in part, was that it let them keep their dogs. To everyone in that building, they looked like an ordinary couple unpacking boxes in a new home. 3 weeks was all it took for that picture to fall apart. The coroner's findings trace it to the night of the 2nd of October, 2014, when neighbors heard the couple arguing loudly, late into the night and on into the early hours of the 3rd. Early that morning, the coroner concluded Marcus Volke killed Mayang Prasetyo, stabbing her in the neck at the end of a long argument. What followed is hard to put into words, and yet it's the reason the crime ever surfaced. Volke dismembered Mayang's body and tried to dissolve and cook the remains using chemicals, and this is where his profession turned into something grotesque. A chef with a known interest in cooking stock and bone broth, he reached for exactly that as his cover story. From the morning of the 3rd, residents in the building started noticing a foul smell, one that thickened over the following day. Anyone who asked got an answer ready to go. The electrician heard that he was cooking pig's broth. The building manager heard that he'd left a pot of stock on the stove and let it burn dry. His hand told a Messier story. Volke had cut it badly enough to need a hospital. And even there the explanations kept shifting because the taxi driver heard that he'd been slicing onions when the knife slipped. The hospital heard that his girlfriend had come at him with a knife, and the electrician heard about a psycho ex-girlfriend wielding a blade he'd grabbed. What finally cracked the whole thing open wasn't suspicion in the usual sense. A household appliance failed. Volke's large stock pot boiled over, shorted the oven, and knocked out the power to the unit, which forced him to call an emergency electrician. That electrician grew suspicious, alerted the building manager, and once they looked inside the unit and saw blood, the manager phoned police on the evening of the 4th of October. A burnt dry pot and a tripped circuit are what put officers at the door. Officers reaching the unit walked into that same overpowering odor, and here the inquest looked closely at something specific, because the smell didn't match what a decomposing body produces. One officer later called it a bad smell, something he'd never smelled before and couldn't really describe. His colleague admitted he'd first taken it for a sick prank, maybe something to do with Halloween, and only once he pieced it together did he understand it was no prank at all. Volke, still inside, asked the officers whether he could secure his dogs. Back through the door he went, locking it behind him, harming himself, and then fleeing over the rear of the property, leaving a trail of blood as he ran. Inside, police found Mayang's remains, and a police dog named Zuma picked up Volke's scent and tracked it away from the building, all the way to an industrial bin in a nearby underground car park. That's where they found Marcus Volke, and he was declared dead that night. The coroner later ruled the death self-inflicted, caused by an incised wound to the neck, and concluded that Volke had taken his own life while trying to avoid being taken into custody. Because that counted as a death in custody under Queensland law, an inquest into both deaths became mandatory, and we'll come back to what it found. First, though, the days right after, because this is where the case turned into something national and then international. On the 7th of October, 2014, one of Queensland's major newspapers, the Courier Mail, put the story on its front page under a headline that read, "Monster Chef and the She-Male." Inside, across pages 4 and 5, another headline read, "Ladyboy and the Butcher," and the whole spread carried bikini photographs of Mayang alongside a heavy emphasis on her being transgender and on her work as an escort. The reaction landed fast and ran wide. Across Australia and around the world, the coverage drew condemnation as transphobic, sensationalist, and as blaming and dehumanizing the victim, with critics arguing that the framing hinted Mayang somehow shared the blame for her own murder while sexualizing a woman who'd been killed. Advocates refused to let it slide. Melody Moore, from Trans Health Australia, told the Brisbane Times, "It's disgusting. It's just sensationalism. It's dehumanizing a trans woman. She is the victim here, and they are vilifying, stigmatizing, and dehumanizing the victim, making her look like she's just as bad as her sick boyfriend." The term she-male, she added, was deeply derogatory. Sally Goldner, from Transgender Victoria, reframed the whole thing. Speaking to the Star Observer, her words were, "This is a case of domestic violence and a victim of crime situation. How someone described themselves in terms of an occupation is irrelevant." She posed a hypothetical, asking whether a victim would ever be labeled a cisgender bank teller killed, and answering plainly that of course they never would, because this was a story about murder, about a victim of crime, and about domestic violence. The Courier-Mail pushed back. The paper's defense rested on 3 points: that this ranked among the most gruesome crimes in Queensland's history and carried genuine public interest, that the terms it printed were terms Mayang herself had used in advertising, and that the photographs came from her own public social media, images it claimed she'd been proud of. A day after the front page ran, an editorial appeared under the heading, "Victim's memory should be valued," and it stopped short of a full apology, stating, "The Courier-Mail had no intention of diminishing the value of Mayang's life or to add to the grief being felt by her family. Mayang," it went on, "should be remembered for her friendly and cheerful disposition and for the care she showed her family in Indonesia." A fuller apology followed later that month. While the media argument raged on, the people closest to the loss answered in their own way. Members of the Brisbane trans community launched a petition that cited the newspaper's own code of conduct against pejorative references to a person's sex, and it gathered tens of thousands of signatures, somewhere around 27,000 in the end. A candlelight vigil gathered at New Farm Park to honor Mayang's life. Gina Mather, president of the Australian Transgender Support Association Queensland, spoke there, calling the vigil a celebration of Mayang's life and also something for everyone, a chance for the wider community to show its support. She also described the kind of psychological control that some transgender women endure, where a partner threatens to reveal who they are unless they fall into line. For Mayang's family, public spectacle piled on top of grief. Her mother, Nining Sukarni, couldn't bring herself to believe it at first, describing Marcus as soft and kind, a man she didn't think capable of hurting anyone, and asking that the media handle her family's feelings gently while they grieved. In time, she offered something that's hard to forget, saying she forgave Volke because he had been part of her family. Nearly 3 years on the 19th of May, 2017, the Queensland State Coroner, Terry Ryan, handed down his findings, and they stand as the most authoritative account we have. Volke killed Mayang Prasetyo by stabbing her in the neck early on the 3rd of October, 2014, the coroner found, before he dismembered her body and tried to dissolve the remains with chemicals, and her cause of death went on record as a stab wound to the neck. Turning to Volke's death, the coroner ruled it self-inflicted and reached a finding that matters, that none of the police officers or anyone else at the unit block caused or contributed to his death in any way. Counsel assisting the coroner stated there'd been no misconduct by any officer involved, and nothing further they could have done at the time. The findings went past cause and manner of death, though. Mayang's killing got framed as a domestic violence death, and pointedly as a reminder of how real domestic violence is within the LGBTI community and how hard that community finds it to address. Borrowing the language of a Queensland Task Force report, the coroner stressed how critical it is that the wider community keeps seeking out, hearing, and responding to the experiences of LGBTI people who live through domestic violence, so their stories don't get lost. No preventive recommendations came out of it, because the coroner saw no missed chance to intervene, given that the couple had only recently arrived in Queensland with limited contact with any support network. Let's circle back to where we started, to the idea that nobody knew who these two people really were. That holds true at every level. Mayang's family didn't know how she earned a living. Marcus's family didn't know about his second life or his debt, or even that Mayang existed. And the neighbors saw nothing but an ordinary couple. The marriage itself was something other than it looked, part genuine and part arrangement, held together in places by money and by the threat of exposure. The phrase cuts a second way as well. In the days after Mayang Prasetyo was killed, A newspaper looked at a murder victim, a woman who supported her mother and sisters and who friends remembered as warm and cheerful, and chose to define her by her gender and her work, in language an Australian press body would later examine and advocates would condemn as dehumanizing. The people telling her story, in that moment, didn't seem to know who she really was either. The coroner's findings settled the facts of the crime, who died, how it happened, and at whose hand. What keeps the case alive in conversation is the distance between two things, between the facts of a human life and the story that ends up getting told about it. That gap is what made this case scarier than any thriller, not because of what sat hidden inside one apartment in Tenerife, but because of how fast a real person can be flattened into a headline. It's a question worth sitting with long after the case itself is closed.